snatch it back and hold it, baby, one more time.
Synido reached out to me again to do another product review. This time it's the TempoKEY K25. So in exchange for an honest review, I get the keyboard. But other than that, they don't get to influence this review. These are my opinions about the unit. They did get to specify when I would release the video. This is going to be a little bit more than a review. I want to go into the details of how this unit works and how to configure it both on board and in the software. So let's get started. My goal here is to both offer some editorial comments on this product, but also walk through how to use most, if not all, of the functionality. I will start by echoing the manual here. This is a MIDI controller. It is not a sound source. You need to connect it to a digital audio workstation or other software or hardware to provide sounds from the unit. Given that the device has a keyboard, it's easy to assume it has a piano or keyboard sound, but it does not. Having already reviewed their Z-1 P64 MIDI controller, I had different and I will admit higher expectations this time around. I suspected the K25 would prove to be useful in both Reaper and AmpliTube. At the time of this recording, the list price was under $90 and discount coupons are available. As Josh Scott would say, that's a couple of cups of coffee. Well, that depends on if you get your caffeine fix in the same exotic store as Josh. I will say it's less expensive than most single boutique pedals. I'll skip the unboxing, but it's packaged very well in a similar manner to the Z1. But the K25 was inside the carrying case, and the box was actually a bit concave from the contents bulging a bit. I think they designed the box a little on the small side, but everything arrived snug and safe. Speaking of contents, the case also comes with a shoulder strap, a separate USB charging only cable, and a polishing cloth, which you'll need as you can see it has a high gloss finish, so it's going to take fingerprints easily. It also comes with the same things the Z1 had, a standard USB-A to C cable, a USB to go adapter for USB-C, an 1/8" to MIDI adapter, and a sticker. The unit is 13.5 inches wide, and that's a bit over 34 centimeters, about 7 inches top to bottom, just under 18 centimeters, and just the case is a tad under 1.4 inches deep, just under 3.5 centimeters. But if you need to pack it, you need room for the knobs. The tallest knob makes the depth a bit over 1.8 inches, or just under 4.7 centimeters. It's a plastic case, and the bottom again has non-skid pads. It weighs in at 2 pounds, 2.2 ounces, or 971 grams. Let's look at the back of the unit, which is the only side with anything functional. The unit comes with a separate power cable that can plug in here. The other end is the USB-A standard and can go in any powered USB port or a wall wart. If you do plug into this port, it takes precedence over the USB-C port for power. So if this cable becomes loose from the other end and loses power, but the USB-C port is still connected, you will still lose power. Not a big deal, just worth knowing. I get the feeling most people aren't going to use this port for powering up. Then we have a connector for a sustain pedal. There is no sustain pedal provided, and I don't have one, so I won't be demoing the connector. Then there is the USB-C connector, which is your main connector for power and getting MIDI messages to your computer. Again, there's no power switch. Plug in the USB cable, and as long as there's no cable in the 5-volt port, the unit powers on. Finally, there is a MIDI out, and they provided a cable for that. So if you wanted to connect this to a MIDI-compatible synthesizer, you could. When you plug it in, it does a left-to-right test of all the lights in the unit. The OLED display under the knob labeled main is really useful. Almost all configuration of the unit can be done without downloading software for your computer. More on configuration in a minute, and I'll talk about the exceptions of the couple of things that can't be configured on board. Let's do a quick left to right, top to bottom review of functionality. The first two strips default to sending pitch and modulation control. These feel like hard plastic, but they feel very accurate and responsive. You can slide or touch on both controls. The pitch has the ability to auto-return to the center, and you can configure the amount of time that return takes. The next section is really two sections. The top section with the main knob can both send out channel volume messages from 0 to 127 when you rotate the knob, and it has a secondary use for configuring the unit. When you press down on the knob, you can feel a click. If you press and hold the knob, you can select another control on the unit by touching it to configure it. The OLED display gives you an indication of what parameter you are configuring. Once you are in configuration mode, rotating the knob moves through the values available for the parameter. When rotated, this knob has detents, so you can feel each value increment in either mode. Pressing the main button again moves to the next parameter. We'll look at some of these configuration details in a minute. Below this area, you have transpose and octave buttons. These buttons are a lighter weight style that has give. These don't feel as nice as the pads, but to me they're okay. When these are having an effect, they light up. For transpose, you can go up and down 6 halftones. When you go up 1 halftone, it turns on the white light. The display also shows us the current value. For step 2, it stays white and blinks. For step 3, it blinks twice. Step 4 turns orange. Step 5 blinks. And step 6 blinks twice. Any subsequent presses just blinks the light and nothing in the unit will change. Press the transpose minus button to move down from +6 to -6. Hitting the 2 keys together resets the transpose to 0. By the way, these buttons aren't sending MIDI data. They are just configuring which data byte goes out when you press a keyboard key. The octave buttons work in a similar manner and move up and down 4 octaves. My keyboard sound source only supports values from 21 to 108 or 88 keys, so when I have no transpose value and I'm up 4 octaves, the last key that works is middle C. When I'm down 4 octaves, only the top 4 keys down to the A key produce sound. Pretty much what I expected. I can play from A0 to C8. This is only important to know in case you're at the extremes of the octave range and you aren't hearing any sounds. It just might be that your sound source doesn't support the value being sent. Moving on, we have 8 velocity sensitive pads. These feel very sturdy and are just like the Z-1 P64 pads. When you send intermittent data, the outside border of the pad lights up as the data goes out. If you're sending CC data in toggle mode, then the border lights up and stays lit when the high value 127 goes out. The light goes out when a value of 0 is sent. Below the pads are some standard transport controls that can be configured to use MMC, MIDI machine control, or CC, change control. In change control, the values can be momentary or toggle mode. To the right are the 8 rotary knobs. While each knob does have some fine knurling, they are a bit slippery. Not enough to cause problems, but they were just slicker than I was expecting. They rotate smoothly. There is no stepping or detents on these. The rotary knobs feel a little like they can be pressed, but pressing them doesn't do anything. These knobs are my favorite part of this unit as they provide me a new MIDI control feature. Below the rotary knobs, on the left side are bank select buttons. The knob bank gives you another 8 rotary knob controls. The pad bank gives you an additional 8 velocity sensitive pads. When you are in the default bank, the switch has a white light. When you switch to the secondary bank, the light turns orange. To the right of that are 4 buttons that mostly affect arpeggiation. The Arp button turns the arpeggiation feature for the keyboard on and off. It lights up orange when it's on, and the light turns off when it's off. The tap tempo button can be used to program the tempo for the arpeggio when it is on, and it flashes with the current tempo in quarter notes. When you tap a tempo, it shows the value in the LED display temporarily. This is the section of the K25 where I find some surprising omissions. The unit is called the TempoKEY, but the tempo feature seems needlessly limited. I could find no way to display the tempo after the initial tap tempo shows it. I also can't find a way to enter a specific tempo, and equally surprising to me is there's no way I could find to put this unit in slave or sync mode to receive the tempo from my DAW. The note repeat function affects how the pad works. When it's on, hitting a pad will play repeated notes at the set tempo. In other words, it continually sends out the MIDI note of that pad at the specified tempo, assuming the pad is set up to send notes. The fixed velocity button will remove dynamic control, and every hit of either the keyboard keys or pads or both will send a velocity value of 127 or whatever maximum value you configure. The bottom of the unit features unweighted keyboard keys. I'm not a keyboard player, but these feel fine. They are made of plastic, relatively small, and have a decent springy feel. They are quiet to operate. There is no aftertouch mechanism built into the keys. I did read through the manual, and it appears to be on par with the Z-1 P64. Some things could be better explained, but in general, I found it pretty helpful. It was particularly useful in figuring out how to use the main button, but that's also the part that could have been a little more explicit. Let's talk about configuration. Press down on the main knob and hold it down. Now you can click on most of the other pads, keys, and buttons to configure them. The exceptions are the transpose, octave, arpeggiation, tap tempo, and note repeat buttons. These have no configuration settings. When you are using configuration mode, if you use your left hand to press down the main button, make sure no part of your hand ends up accidentally touching the pitch or modulation areas, or you might accidentally be configuring them. I mention this because it happened to me multiple times. All of the piano keys configure a single setting that applies to all the keys. Press and hold the main button, hit any one of the keyboard keys. The display shows piano keys. You can release the main button. The first parameter is for the sensitivity of the keys. The default is linear. If you play very, very lightly and want to more easily reach full volume, you can set the value to log for logarithmic. If you want more feel for the lower volume notes and you want to hit hard to reach the max volume, use EXP exponential. I prefer this setting, although I find it impossible to get a velocity much past 1/16, but I find it much easier to play quieter but still audible notes. Click the main button to move to the next parameter, which is the channel number. If you don't need to change this, just click the main knob again. Now the display should be prompting you to save changes. A final click will save changes. If you rotate the knob, it will offer to cancel the changes. Continue to rotate to cycle back to save. You get about 8 seconds to make any given change. If you're inactive for too long, the unit exits the configuration mode. I think this time limit is too short. My first preference would have been to have an exit button. My second would be to use a button that makes no sense in configuration, like tap tempo to exit configuration. A third option would be a double click of the main button to exit. But at a minimum, I think this timeout needs to be extended. If you do get auto exited, it's not the end of the world. You can repeat the process to get back to configuration mode. A couple of times I had trouble getting back in when the default cancel message was displayed. Rotating the main knob seemed to clear that issue. Let's configure a pad. The process is similar to the keys, except each pad is configurable. If we keep the main knob down, we can click on any pad or any other control to switch what we want to configure. A pad also has a few more options. At first, we can configure the type of MIDI message, CC for control change, PC for program change, or note. What you select here will affect the other parameters you can change, but the next parameter is always the channel. For a CC message, the parameter after the channel is the CC data value. The next parameter lets us specify whether we want toggle or momentary mode. Rotary knobs are very similar. The big difference is in the first step, you hold down the main knob and just rotate the knob you want to control. After that, things are similar, but you do get options for setting the min and max values for that control. The arpeggiation feature has the most complexity in terms of configuration. I doubt I will ever use this, but we can touch on the basics. Arpeggiation is configured differently and can be confusing at first, but a little experimenting here makes the operation fairly clear. First, make sure the ARP function is on, the light is on. The manual doesn't mention this, but it didn't work for me if it wasn't on first. Then there are two ways to configure. You can press and hold the ARP key and hit any of the keys on the keyboard. This is pretty convenient when you just want to change a single parameter, like say the number of octaves the arpeggiation uses. The display updates for any change you make. The white labels above the keys indicate which key does what when configuring. All of them, except for latch, are single value. You press the key and it changes the relevant parameter to that value. So if we hit the 1/16th triplet key, the timing of arpeggiation will change to 16th note triplets, and we see the value change in the display. For latch, when we hit it, it toggles between on and off. When you release the ARP key, you're out of configuration mode. It wasn't in the manual, but if you want to change multiple settings at once, there is another configuration mode. First, make sure the ARP button is orange. You'll see the current settings in the OLED display. Now, press and hold down the main knob, and while it's down, press the ARP button again. Nothing changes in the display or the button, but it should now be in configuration mode. All the white and black keys on the keyboard will make a change to the configuration. There is no timeout for this mode. There is also no save or cancel changes. The changes are immediate. Press the Arp key again to exit this mode. Note that rotating the main knob does nothing in this mode. It might make you think that you've left configuration mode if you rotate it, as the message will change to show the volume, but if you hit another keyboard key, the corresponding parameter will change. Before we look at the included software, let's do a quick demo with everything at the default settings. I have a virtual synthesizer set up in Reaper. Hitting the keyboard keys does just what you'd expect. Hitting the pad keys also plays the synth, as they are set up for nodes by default. We can make transpose, and octave changes on the fly with the keyboard. Note that these have no effect on the notes played by the pads, only by the keyboard keys. I can touch the pitch control and release to make immediate bends. I can also slide to do more gradual bends. If I turn on a modulation effect in Reaper, I can use the modulation slider to make changes. I switch over to strings in Reaper. Let's turn on arpeggiation and press some random keys. I'm going to program aftertouch on one of the knobs. Now when I press a key, I can rotate the knob as long as my sound source supports aftertouch messages. Let's bring up AmpliTube, and I can go over my favorite feature of this device. Turning knobs with a mouse is not great fun, and it feels a little unintuitive and clunky. Turning knobs with knobs, on the other hand, well. Here's an amp. I'll map the EQ controls to the bottom row. I can click on each control and learn, and then turn the knob on the Z-25. I'll map the gain, reverb, and volume controls to the top row. My philosophy is I'm going to try and be consistent across various amps. You might prefer to map the knobs to the order they are shown on the screen. Having these knobs really makes me wish AmpliTube had global settings for standard amp controls, so I could assign these once and have them available for every modeled amp. This does work well and it feels great. If you tend to use only a few amps or presets and like to tweak settings as you go, this works out pretty well. You can use Bank B if you have an amp with a lot of controls, or if you want to control pedal values in a preset. You could then set up the pad buttons to toggle various stomp pedals on and off. If I didn't have a foot controller, I would want to reserve one bank of pads for selecting presets and the other bank of pads for toggling either pedals or switches on amps. My wish here is that the pad bank button worked more like the octave button and would cycle through more banks. Let's go over to the computer and take a look at the software. On the Mac, you can get the software directly from the App Store, but I assume on Windows you need the Synido website, which is at synido.com. You want to go to Support, and then Downloads, then scroll down to the TempoKEY area. If you click for the Mac, it will launch the App Store and take you to the app, or you could have just searched the Apple Store for Synido K25. I'll click Download to bring up the App Store. I've already installed it, so let me bring up the app. First, note that if you want to get back to the factory defaults, the File menu has a Restore the Default option. Once you select this, you can press the Send to Hardware button, and the K25 will be as it was when you got it. The second thing to note is that you can also update the firmware here. On the Mac, it's under the Synido MIDI menu. Select the About Synido MIDI option. In the resulting dialog, you can use the firmware upgrade. I've already done this, and at the time of this recording, V1.1 is the latest version. The only items you can configure here that you can't configure from the unit itself are the sensitivity curve for the pads and the sustain values. That's done here in the lower right in the function area. The pads have the same options as the keyboard keys mentioned earlier. The sustain has options for normal and reverse. The sustain settings are not mentioned in the user manual. A couple of things to note. There is no way to configure the keyboard keys to send out something other than a note message. That's too bad. If I could send CC or PC messages here, I wouldn't need more banks for the pad. The 25 keys coupled with the octave buttons would more than cover the 128 possible program control messages I want to send. You can map PC messages to the rotary knobs. While that can send out 128 different values, I would suggest limiting the min-max values here to something in the 15 to 30 range. Left at the 0 to 127 range, I can't reliably get to a specific preset, but with only 15 values, it's very easy. The OLED panel shows what value is sent out, so that does help with what you're selecting. The fact that you can do this makes me wish these knobs had a detent mode that I could toggle on or off. Then I imagine I could use the full range of values. To me, those are the most interesting but non-obvious things in the software. However, we can quickly go through the standard operations. The pitch and mod configuration is over here on the left on the bottom. The graphic of the controls themselves doesn't do anything. The two banks of pads are configured in the pad area. Use the tabs to switch between the banks. Each bank can send either note, CC, or PC data. You can configure the note with the top entry area, and it shows the corresponding note on the keyboard. When you are in CC or PC data, the key area shows NA. When you select CC data, you can specify if it's momentary, meaning that the data value of 127 will go out immediately, followed by the data value of 0, or one tap will send 127 and the next will send 0. When you are sending note data, each tap sends the note on message with the velocity data and then the note off message. The timing is generally in the 5 to 50 millisecond range between the two values. The channel here and elsewhere displays a drop-down menu with the values of 1 through 16. The transport controls are below the pads. The loop button can only send a CC message, and you can specify the data value. All the other transport controls can be configured to send either MMC or CC messages. The knobs work a lot like the pads, but this is the only area I've found where you can do more from the unit itself than the software. I think it's a bug in the software, but when you select touch, the min and max values dim out and can't be changed. But on the K25 itself, you can configure these. By default, the min values on the K25 appear to get the value set for the number in this interface, but you can modify this to 0. Touch sends out the channel pressure MIDI message, so setting more than one knob to touch doesn't do much other than give you multiple ways to send the same data. When you press a key on the keyboard with a sound source that supports aftertouch, you can rotate the knob assigned to channel pressure to simulate aftertouch. As I mentioned earlier, the keyboard itself doesn't support an aftertouch feature. CC and PC work as you would expect. The top value sets the first data byte for the message, and the min-max values constrain the second byte to the specified range. The arpeggiator section does have a way to set the tempo to a specific value by entering the value. Yay! Still, it's a little bit much to have to come to the software just to do that. The other settings display drop-down menus with the allowed values. If you configure from here, use the Send to Hardware button to get your changes into the K25. If you want to capture the current settings, use the Get from Hardware. The lower right area shows an orange dot when the software recognizes that the K25 is attached. When you've configured the settings, use the File menu to save off your changes to a file. You can save multiple configurations for various workflows and use the File Open option to get a needed configuration and then send it down to the unit. The Auto Populate menu has a single option that opens a dialog. This lets you batch configure the pads or knobs. The checkbox at the top of each section lets you specify the type of MIDI message you want sent for that control. We have another typo here in the pads area in the notes section. That first drop-down item should spell chromatic. After that are the other standard scale modes. You can click in the starting at number section on the left to customize the starting value by typing, or use the right-hand side to show a menu of notes and have that set the corresponding integer value. If you set the value too high and use ascending, the values above 127 will just get set to 127. For all message types, you can specify ascending or descending to make the data byte sent increase or decrease for each control. For CC, you can additionally specify whether you want momentary or toggle mode. You can then specify if you want to use these values for one bank or the other or both. Surprisingly, using apply to A and B doesn't continue the sequence across both banks the way I was expecting, but instead it starts over and you end up with the same set of values for both banks. This negates the usefulness of the A and B button for me, and I suspect most people will want to use the individual bank buttons. Outside of the limits for setting and displaying the tempo, I think they did a nice job here. I did have a few things I thought could be improved, but for the most part, they were minor nits. If you are after the arpeggiation features, make sure you can live with the tempo limitations I've described. As a guitar player, I mostly find value in these devices as MIDI controllers for software, and the standout feature here for that are those 2 banks of 8 rotary knobs. I also like having a small keyboard with a minimal footprint for experimenting with virtual instruments in my DAW. I am again pleased at the value here. It's a tempting combination of price, build quality, and features, depending on what your needs are. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth look at the K25. MIDI away in peace.